Great. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very, very much for coming and for bearing with the little organizational details of figuring out which kind of Zoom meeting we actually need in order to do something like this. My name is Chad Carlson. If you didn't come and see my talk, very nice to meet you all. And with me today are is Robert Pack in the room yet?
No, he's still on the webinar.
Okay. Guillaume, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I've been with Platform for a long, long time. Originally, mostly a PHP developer for 18 years, moving to new technologies as well and new stacks. And I've been playing with Strapi also for about a year. So I'm used to basically train and do all the technical pre-sales for our client.
Well, thank you again for helping me out with this. I know I hooked up with Pierre about that same time ago, year and a half ago, first playing around with Strapi. In this workshop, the goal would be, again, if you haven't checked out the Platform.sh examples repo that I placed in the chat right there, please do, and click that deploy on platform button so we can get started. The goal of this workshop would be to maybe familiarize yourself with how things kind of work on Platform.sh and how that fits in with deploying Strapi. And by the end of this workshop, the goal would be to have a production Strapi instance that within the same project, the content that we're serving, which we're taking from Strapi's Food Advisor repository, that example, being fed into a front-end React app, just like in that same repo, but instead on Platform.sh, all from one project. So we'll end up with an application container containing Strapi and another one that has that front-end React JS app. So before we start on off, again, we can hit this deploy button, and what it'll do, it'll allow you to start off your free trial account, and you'll end up with a project that looks like this. This is our management console. This is the way that we interact in the browser with our projects. We'll do some with the CLI as well during this workshop. But you'll see here, I have initialized a project from that link that's listed in that README. And once it's finished its deployment, it's going to generate a URL for me with my production Strapi application that I can log into with what I already have set up. And we're going to have a data set already loaded in here, again, from that Food Advisor app. And it's going to include, we're basically building a restaurant review site. And here we have category collection of the different types of restaurants, likes that people have placed on either reviews or the restaurants themselves, restaurants that fit into those categories, reviews, and a couple other components, users who are leaving reviews, and universals like the About Us section of the site. And so this is really all we have so far. And we can see that it's also going to set up some default public permissions. So each one of these endpoints is already publicly available. And that is about what we have on the site so far. Let's try and think. If we do have any other text questions that I guess we could just keep them in the chat. That's not really relevant. So during this workshop, the goal here would be, again, a little introduction to Platform.sh and working with Strapi on platform. And this is going to be our broad outline. We're going to get used to making some changes to Strapi, interacting with the management console to create new development environments. And we'll go into how that works and what those are. How we can take the default deployment, which in this case is using SQLite to store all this restaurant data, and use some of the managed services that Platform provides to add a Postgres database and migrate data over to that so we can do a full switch out on that Strapi application. And then move on to actually branching off and adding that front end app. And for good measure, including some tests before we can kind of just take an overview of what we've done and maybe have some time for discussion about what we've run into as working great with Strapi on platform, or things to consider and keep in mind when you try to do certain things, kind of like on my talk, write access, development servers, things like that. So again, start your free trial account and get the CLI locally for yourselves. And once you have all that, a good idea would be to get this project ID, which you'll see is right here in the management console. You'd use that CLI to get a copy of that repository locally. And that's all on the first page of the README there. And just to give you guys some time to do with that, I'll move on to the introduction. Make sure I'm not missing any messages. Okay, so Platform.sh. Maybe some of you guys have worked with it before, perhaps not. Everything about Platform is based off of Git-driven infrastructure. So if we look at our initial repo, everything related to this application is committed into Git. We have our Strapi application that has within it defined how we're going to build the infrastructure on Platform.sh, exactly how we want our dependencies defined. We have our yarn lock file here, and every bit of our application code. For Platform, the big part of what we're trying to leverage with Git is this infrastructure as code concept. So we'll get into all of this in a lot more detail in a little bit, but here is sort of what the configuration looks like for building the Strapi app all by itself. Again, when it's still just feeding in SQLite data. We can name it and give it something unique in this cluster of containers that we're going to end up deploying. We could say what version of Node.js that we want, and a lot of other features that we'll go through in the workshop. But the whole idea being whether it's which version of Node.js do I want, or how many application containers do I have in the cluster? You know, does it include a front end or not? Do I use Postgres or not? These are all committed features of the repository. I'm sure you've come across another version of this same idea, but this is a lot of what our syntax looks like so that you can branch something off. And really the whole idea is that you'll be able to rely on the fact that in some new environments, you're going to have the exact same infrastructure as production, but very easily be able to play around with that infrastructure with just a few character edits and a few pieces of YAML to change how your project is structured. If we take another look at the management console here, you'll see that we have this graphic here that's going to show us what the organization of our cluster of containers looks like. So right now, because I'm using SQLite and that's just something that's being written in the app container for Strapi itself, there's nothing else other than we have a router container that says, here's how I want to handle requests. In this case, what do I do when somebody goes to this API subdomain? In this case, directs it to this other thing in the cluster, the Strapi app container. And so progressively, we're going to add little pieces of code to expand out this service graph at the bottom to build out this cluster of containers. We're starting off with a master environment. If we take we have a project level view here of what we deployed by clicking that deploy on platform button. We have only a master environment to begin with, but progressively we're going to run some commands via the CLI that's going to branch off of this original master environment and create some exact copies of all our code and our data that we could then play around with. But they're environments that are totally isolated from one another at the same time. So we can have a lot of flexibility to test out these changes and get a really repeatable build image at the end of it that we can push up to master when we do finally do our merge. I think that's enough. We'll get to the rest of it while we're going along. So here is that example repo locally for me. And so again, here is my Strapi application, and we'll get into it a little bit later about why these are all in subdirectories, but we have all the documentation. I'm going to keep going back to GitHub for there, but I have Strapi in a subdirectory. And all of the configuration for this master environment is expressed in these 3 configuration files here. That main app YAML file that I showed briefly earlier. I saw the VS Code stuff. Sorry. This is what I showed you earlier that expresses how Strapi is going to be built. And then I also have 2 other configuration files that are named accordingly. I have a services YAML that's going to say, do I want any database? Again, from that service graph I showed you, I don't have any services at this point, but we're going to add to this file. And then I have this routes YAML file that's going to say, I have this router container here. And in this file, I say, hey, I only care about traffic at this API subdomain, and anything with the WW is going to redirect to something that is handling an upstream from this Strapi application. So we have the same unique name here that we have in the name of our application here. If we go through this file for a moment, we can see, let's take this part here first. So what's happening here is I am detecting that there's this yarn lock file, and I'm telling my application container that's been set up to, as its primary runtime, be Node.js 12, to install yarn as a build dependency before I even look at that file, but then use yarn to install those dependencies, keep that lock file frozen, and then run a build for Strapi with this nodem production environment variable. And so from that, we're going to get our Strapi build within that application container. And before I get into all this, we have a start command that's going to run immediately after that build completes. And that's it. We may add some stuff later. Anything that's in here, all that it's doing is running the same seed script that's inside the food advisor repository. So it's just going to post build, create some of our collections in here, and use this data zip to initialize our media uploads and everything inside of that SQLite database. This is a nice little picture, if you're following along in the documentation, of how many of these environments you could really have going on at the same time. We're not going to have this kind of structure, but just as the sort of caveat, you see that this clearly isn't a prod stage dev sort of structure. It's really, I can use Git to its fullest extent to have any structure that I want as far as how these environments are related to each other. So everything is inheriting code and data in all of these environments, but something specific to these tests and bug fixes, things to QA and front-end fixes, and so on. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to split this off because otherwise I'm just going to be flickering back and forth the whole time. Okay, so I want to start off by just getting familiar with how this branching stuff works. So I have my app YAML file for Strapi, and we're building just fine. So let's just make a change that's pretty easy. So first I'm going to use my CLI to create a new environment off of master. If I go to project, we'll see that it's generating there and bunching up the UI. And that'll take a second. But basically what I want to do here is Strapi, which here, I don't think it always did this. This is a newer release. It's Strapi automatically is going to generate this open API specification for us. And it's going to exist inside of this subdirectory here. So Strapi extensions, documentation, 1.0 full documentation JSON. So what I want to do as just a real quick small change is I'm going to modify this web block, which you have a lot of flexibility here. First off, we're using it to define this start command for Strapi, but I can also do things like redefine a specific location of our Strapi API URL. So in this case, I'm going to add a new location definition that's going to say, hey, I want at all times from this doc spec endpoint really to be my specification. I don't know if it's that I want to start being able to pull only if you have the documentation plug. I thought so for some reason, I guess, because I started off the food advisor thing. Let's say I want to use Postman to run some tests on my application. Real easy way is then I can continuously point at this endpoint that I have defined and maybe even put a little flare into it so I don't have to be as specific for this version number. But either way, I can continue to point at that endpoint and get that specification. We can take a look at the deployment.
So what's interesting to see there is basically whenever you're going to create a new branch, we automatically bootstrap a new environment. And that environment, once again, is based on the code, the configuration, and the data you've got. The thing we've worked in the past for platform is basically have a data layer that include all your different databases, MySQL, Postgres, anything like this, and all your cache mechanism, Redis, Memcache, basically everything that holds some data, and clone it in just a couple minutes, no matter how much data you've got in those services. So even if you've got, I don't know, a 1 terabyte MySQL instance, that would be a terrible idea, but that just was the example. We are able to clone that in just a couple minutes. So that's a big difference with, let's say, a more traditional setup, even if you're working with Docker thing and stuff where you need to export, dump, pre-import. Everything is done automatically. So just to go over the question that was asked in the chat, you can also specify in that YAML file what you want to do with that data. Obviously, on the development environment, you don't want to have real user email address or credit cards or anything like this. So you can automate launching a script and sanitizing that data if you need it. Go ahead, Chad.
Thanks, friend. So you see here, we have all that same production data here on this development environment. And so I'm going to make that one change here. So and then we're going to go through that build process again so that we can make this public. How many people are following along with that? It's the first small change there.
I do. So once again, something really specific to platform is that every time you're going to commit and push some changes, we're going to rebuild everything. And that's really important because, well, no matter who is pushing that code in your team, let's say you have got 10 or 12 developers, the build process will always be the same and on our side. If something goes wrong in that process, let's say, I don't know, you've got an NPM dependencies like left pad that is not available anymore, we're going to stop the process and give you a message saying that you need to fix that. So we won't deploy a broken release or anything like this. The second really good thing about this is on the build process is done, we've got a fully ready artifact that we can deploy to different servers and that we can reuse between different environments. That's going to be the next step, but that guarantees basically immutable builds. And that's really good because once again, our goal is to make sure that you test on a real environment with everything the same as your production. So whenever we build, test something, and then deploy that container, we know that it will be exactly the same running on the other environment as well. But obviously, it takes a bit of time as we need to rebuild everything. So that's why I'm trying to come up with some discussion to cover that time.
No, we'll see that as it's building out the application. But yeah, I know I debated that a little bit of trying to finagle some way to exploit the build cache to make this go along a little faster. But it's an important point. I mean, we don't want any aspect of our build, to prevent that from giving us a good idea that something may be wrong before we do any of the merges that we're going to do in a workshop or production app or whatever. So gives everybody an opportunity to, do the pre-workshop steps that I probably didn't give enough time for everybody to do and get up to speed with this one change themselves and take a look at the project in the console. But we're coming up at the end of the deployment here.
So the build phase is basically getting every dependency that you need in order to run and compile your project. So on more traditional PHP languages, that means going to run Composer and packages like this. On Node projects, running npm or yarn to get the package.json file. And we're going to fetch all those dependencies and run any action that you need after that. So if you need to compile front-end assets or whatever you want, you can do that. You get access to all the features that our Debian underlying system has. So even if you want to GCC things or make things, you can as well. And as you can see on Chat's terminal, we're also taking care of generating all the different TLS certificates for every endpoint every time you need them. Obviously, we use Let's Encrypt to do that, but you get HTTPS everywhere. So if you want to connect your Strapi API to any other external test system, you can get that for HTTPS.
And those things will renew automatically in the background, I think like a month before they expire. So yeah, here's our doc spec endpoint here. So we're free to use that in any of the Postman tests that we want to set up. And we'll get into testing a little bit later and you'll see where we might want to call that. Okay, looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to continue to use the CLI here and merge that spec environment into master.
We forgot to mention, but if anyone has a problem running a command or anything like this, feel free to ping me or Robert Douglas in that call, and we'll make a breakout room to go through the steps with you.
Yeah, I'm also monitoring the Discord room. If you want to chat there as well, there's Platform.sh-workshop on the Discord server, and I'm monitoring that as well.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for this.
This will be my first workshop, so I'm sure I will go too fast and forget to mention important facts like those two things. I see the chat there.
I thought about these build times as I was going through it prior to the workshop and what to think about those. And to me, what it really shows is that this is a development workflow tool, Platform.sh, and that if we were packaging, a prepackaged, completely built container and just shipping it up to a cloud, of course, that would start faster. But that's not a development workflow. So I thought about that while we were preparing this, and thinking about sitting in front of a bunch of attendees on the workshop, explaining what's going on and why it takes. It took me about 4 to 5 minutes per deploy, and why it takes that much time. And it's everything that Guillaume and Chad just explained going on in the background, so that you can really build your code freshly each time.
But we do end up here with that specification endpoint here on production. And you'll see here, I didn't actually lose this spec environment, so I could continue to develop on there and continue to push up to production, or I can close it and do something else. But I'm going to leave a couple of these open because maybe we'll have time to get into those. Some other fun things we could do. Stop dropping down. All right, great. So now we're going to get into the services of the thing. So we want to get away from this SQLite file, which you'll see actually here. Actually, I'll clean up my stuff out. If I take a look at my Strapi configuration file on master, you see I have this .tmp mount. So in the same way that we might take a little bit longer to rebuild your code every single push, part of what we can get out of that is the assurance of this final build image. And part of what allows us to support that idea is that once the build phase is done, everything exists on a read-only file system. So if there does need to be something that needs write access at runtime, that's not going to be part of the commit history, we do it in these mount definitions here in the same file. So in this case, I have something for my public uploads. These all have to do with my seeding. I have this cache directory, but here is where I'm really allowing myself to not have something like Postgres attached to my Strapi site, but continue to write to this SQLite database. And we consider these things managed services. So what that means. You all hear that too?
Yeah, I'm not sure. If somebody was trying to ask a question, go try again. It broke up.
Yeah, it was Chris.
I think, yeah, it was Chris, but he muted himself, so I think it was a mistake.
Okay. So what we're going to do first is I'll get into the explanation of this. And allow this thing to build for us in the background while we're talking. So we're going to go back to this services YAML file, and we're going to add some configuration for Postgres. So we consider all these things managed services. So I can go ahead and define this thing as saying, hey, I want to use Postgres SQL 12. And at any time I might want to consider upgrading that, and I can spawn off a development environment and change this value here. But these things are managed because rather than some of these other providers where you may very well need to be completely in charge of maintaining these things when there's a security release on Postgres 12, that occurs in the background from these base images that we provide. You can go ahead and say, I want Postgres 12, and then periodically as security updates are released, we can issue them and make them available for this Strapi database. And then they're available, and then you happen to do a redeploy and they get subbed right back out in the back end, and your data gets replaced on that image, and you don't have to worry about security updates or anything like that aside from what you changed inside this committed file right here. So I've defined the service itself. This is going to tell Platform.sh, hey, I want to include a Postgres container inside my cluster. Okay, that's fine, but I need to allow Strapi to communicate with it. So we do that with this relationships block here. So go back to Strapi. Doesn't quite matter where you put it, but I like it here. Okay, so what this will do is in the application container, I can communicate with PostgreSQL through this database key. And so what it'll end up being is the host address for it in the internal network will be database.internal. It's not super important, but you'll probably see it as I move along, and that's where that comes from. All right, so let's modify Strapi itself so it can actually use this relationship. And so I'm going to do that in my database.js file. And this is a large file to copy. But we'll do that and then we'll look at it. So here I'm using a few things. We have a library at Platform that allows you to make better use of some of the environment variables that we define automatically inside of these app containers. So one of those is going to be, what are the credentials to connect to this database? So that's what this library is going to help us do. It's going to grab those variables and base64 decode them, look up the given relationship that we're using inside of the app YAML file. And then this whole block here is just allowing me to continue to use SQLite locally if I wanted to. And then it's going to check. It's going to say, okay, are we on Platform.sh and are we not in a build? This catch right here actually has to do with the fact that during the build phase, during the build phase, everything, is somebody asking a question? No? Sorry, guys. I keep hearing a little like whisper. So during this build phase, all these containers are going to be completely isolated. They're going to have write access to the file system, but none of them could communicate with each other. So this is a catch to say, I'm on Platform, but I'm definitely in the deploy phase. And during deploys, these containers can start to talk to each other. And so if both of those are satisfied, I'm going to grab the credentials from the environment and I'm going to define my settings here. And this is just classic Strapi configuration in their documentation. And from my credentials, I'm going to grab the host, the port, path, username, and password provided by that database in that environment variable. And so this looks pretty generic, right? The only thing here is database, and we've committed that. And these are all attributes that are committed as well. So we can keep it general so that we can continue to communicate with this database across all of our environments. Because again, as soon as we branch off and create a new environment, we're going to have an exact copy of this Postgres database as soon as we merge it on each of those. So we can use this same configuration to continue communicating with a Postgres database rather than just the production one. So these are just little cues for me inside the deploy hook. But that's really all that we need to do. So I'm going to add and commit that. And push that up to my environment. And then we'll go ahead and wait. And I probably should have done that while I was talking. Any questions so far on what we mean by managed services, or even what we're changing here? Or maybe the consequences of what happened to all the data we had in that SQLite database?
Well, what I can say that using Postgres is much better than using a SQLite in production. So SQLite is really nice to get started with Strapi, especially if you use the -- quick start in the CLI. So we introduced SQLite to really help people getting started within a few minutes. But we definitely recommend to use Postgres or MySQL when it's for a production project. So it's definitely an important step when it comes to deploying a Strapi project.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also curious if anybody out there is actually participating and playing along or going through the instructions on their own, and if you're running into any problems of any kind.
Please let us know. I'm happy to stop and we can break out, and so you guys can have yourselves this exact demo by the end of it. I'd zoomed in here a little bit to show you that this service graph is now changed. So we have this Postgres database here as part of the cluster, connect to Strapi. In the management console, actually, we can inspect some of these here in the management console. So I see I have all of my routes that are being pulled from my configuration here. My Strapi app configuration in Postgres. Within these environments, we can do a couple other things in the management console just while I'm killing time while this thing builds. We have these two options here of access and variables. So everything's going to be reflected from our repository in the creation and destruction of these environments. And often I'll integrate this to a GitHub repo, and just every pull request, that's when environments get created and destroyed when they are merged. But I can go into any of these environments and say things like, hey, I want an environment specific variable that I can set here, or I want to selectively give somebody access to just this environment and help me figure out why Postgres isn't connecting properly, why this database JS configuration that I have isn't working right.
And that's something really important, because you can specify variables, for example, for production, if you want to access an external API endpoint, and you can override that value, for example, in your staging environment, meaning all the environment beneath will automatically get that new dev value instead of a production one. So you won't be mistakenly using a production credential on a dev environment. And that also means that if someone has access to only staging, for example, they won't be able to see that production value as well. So if you're working with third parties, contractors, interns, always good to keep those secrets a bit more secret.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay, so that is finished. So we've got, how do I stop this? Done it before. Okay. Okay, so we have our Strapi app here. And so I'm going to go ahead and log in. Nope, can't do that because I have a completely empty database. So what I have here inside the repository from when you follow along is I have a dump file that admittedly is incomplete from the rest of the demo, but will at least get us far enough to continue building this thing out. And I'm going to use the CLI to pipe it into our newly created Postgres database. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And that is kept here. So I'm in Strapi, scripts, and that's not a script, but that's where it is. These are all the little modification files. So here it's pretty much going to mimic like 5 restaurants, 5 users, 5 likes, 5 reviews. And here we go. I still have to create a new admin user, so I'm going to re-register.
Oh, you're good. You just need to switch the URL.
What's that?
Oh, go ahead, chat. Don't worry.
Okay, so all of our collections are still committed, so we didn't lose any of our permissions, but we do have, and we have the same collections, but we have this subset of data. But these are now sitting on our Postgres database. And so we have all these restaurants, we have 1 like actually, and we have some restaurants, and we have some reviews. Exactly. And you'll see here that some of these images don't work, but we're going to get to that in a second. But yeah, we've migrated our database now onto Postgres, and I can check to make sure my permissions didn't get screwed up. So here we can still access those via the API. So good enough for me. we've done the migration and we can modify this data as we want, but now we have all the data that we're concerned with from now on is going to be interacting with that Postgres container. So I'm going to merge that DB environment into master and trigger that there.
And one thing you can show in the meantime is maybe the backup system in Platform, which is also very, very helpful to back up both the database and also the assets. And that's a good thing if you use a CMS like Strapi, that you can actually use the backups to, of course, back up the content of the Postgres database, but also all of the assets that are going to be uploaded on the server.
Yeah, backups are basically full snapshots of an environment, including, once again, the Git repository, so the code and configuration, and the data for all database files and stuff like this. It takes usually 15, 20 seconds to create a backup, no matter how much data you've got. And then you can restore those backups on the same environment, or also create a new environment from that backup if you need to. So you can connect to the two different databases, see the difference and stuff like this.
Exactly, and you can, and I think you can actually automate the backups through the platform app.yml file.
Yeah, that's right.
Kind of cron task. Yeah, that's cool.
You can define the frequency and the retention for those backups, but obviously for all our production websites, we automate this and do 4 backups a day.
Nice.
Go ahead and clean up my local here. And if we look at that backup is finished, if we go ahead and go to our master environment here, actually, we see that I have to re-register my admin user again. So our data model is any of my children can inherit all of my data, but that data doesn't flow the other way. So as soon as I do this for the final time on production, which is going to work because I just tested it on development with the exact same build image, then every child environment will inherit. This is how it's connected to Postgres, and this is the data that's inside that database. But until then, I have to do it manually one last time. So
the reason for this is that you obviously don't want to overwrite a production database with some test and staging data.
So we're never going to overwrite it, but once we do our migration, we'll continue to inherit that data just like we would want. So I'm going to quickly, everybody sees my personal email address because I've been doing it so many times while I've been going through these.
Expect lots of fan mail.
I just now realized that. Just wrote. Okay, so we are on production, and I will zoom back out because this is crazy. And we have all the same data we just showed on the development environment. I have an admin user, looks pretty good. And we have this new service graph that has Postgres database on it. So let's get to the fun one. So whole point of developing this API and serving it up is so something can consume it. So let's do that. So a lot of the other times that you might come across solutions that try to pitch this decoupled patterns to say like, okay, you go to this hosting platform and have your Strapi instance, and then we're the other guy who's going to host your front-end Gatsby site. and we can set some environment variables and have things pretty hard coded, but a really great setup for them communicating with each other, but they are completely isolated. So Platform.sh has this other option of supporting this multi-app configuration. So I said I was going to come back to the fact that in our repository, we have Strapi in the subdirectory. I also have a client app in a subdirectory, same as in that original Food Advisor demo repo. And so seems to reason that all I would really need to do is add some kind of definition to this client application that says this is how it builds and deploys. And then I provide some kind of definition that says, okay, how does the front end application get data from the back end one? So that's what we're going to do in this step. First off, I need to tell the router container, well, I didn't branch off yet. Got to go through every step or you break things live. So I'm going to go to my routes YAML file. And up to this point, all I have defined is this API subdomain for the Strapi app. So I'm going to replace that with now 4 keys. Same one we had before, but I'm going to point to this new front-end app that's going to be at our primary URL. It's going to be generated for every environment. And so this is a nice little placeholder that allows us to do this exact same definition. Same with the idea of abstracting away database internal. I can abstract away this root, and so it can act exactly the same way as long as it's the same committed file across these environments. And I am going to add a new file here. To my client application. And so as I showed in this roots YAML file, I have to name it the unique name of front end. It's going to use the same version of Node.js. It's going to use Yarn and download that during the pre-build stage and install all of the dependencies I have in my Yarn lock file. And then I'm going to, same thing, define a start command. In this case, I'm going to pass this backend URL to the set aside React app prefix as I call this start command. And I have one mount defined. So how do I get this backend URL? Played around with this, and it does not accept the internal network, let's say Strapi internal that I might make, creating a relationship in here in the same way as I did the database, because it doesn't like HTTP when React builds. So instead, we are going to use another environment variable that gets defined by Platform automatically, which is this file put into a base64 encoded JSON object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this file. Mint, still spelled it wrong. And so this file is going to get sourced on the start command onwards. Every one of those phases, every time you SSH into the container, it's going to source this file. And so in that file, I'm going to place a couple definitions and spit it out. So it's going to say, okay, let's look at this platform roots environment variable. I'm going to decode it and use an already installed library that we have in all the app containers called JQ to manipulate that JSON object that we decode out of here. And we're going to look for something that has an ID called API. And I didn't address it at the time, but the upstream root for Strapi has this ID API. So great. So now that's going to define it as a variable called environment. And then I'm going to chop off that trailing slash to get this backend URL variable that when sourced during the start command is going to be used during my React start command. Coolio. And that is all we need to change to add another application to this project. Any questions, anybody? Any jokes?
I told a joke in the chat, but nobody laughed.
I missed your jokes.
Same. I missed it.
I said that we rewrote our CLI in PHP this month.
Never joke about PHP. Never.
Even though it's the oldest trick in the book, Strapi really pulled it off this year by saying that they had rewritten Strapi in PHP on April 1st.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was not the best joke ever. I agree.
And it really worked very well. It had
It did actually. Yeah.
A very good response.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't connect it initially. I remember reading that and going, oh no.
Yeah. And, every programming language has its pros and cons, so nobody should criticize negatively other languages.
There will come a day when our CLA is written in Go and is cross-platform binary. The day will come.
Is it? Nice.
The day will come.
Okay, the day will come. Okay, yeah. Okay.
If PHP was good, we were bringing down our revenue a lot. So let's enjoy that.
Yeah. I don't know what's the exact percentage of the web running on top of PHP. I think the numbers are still like really, really high. Maybe
it's incredible.
Even more than 90%, probably. Yeah.
I'm gonna be honest. Platform.sh right now has 87% of PHP projects.
Yeah.
Wow.
But that just mirrors the web.
Yeah.
That's just a one-to-one translation of what people actually do on the web.
Okay. That's interesting.
But Node.js is growing every month, a lot more than any other technology like Golang or Python or anything like this.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you the question about the trend that you can see. But yeah, it has been growing like crazy for 10 years now. It's really cool.
So we got our front end app here. So if you see in this service graph, showed it briefly, Strapi, front end app, and Postgres being consumed from Strapi here. And not the bang celebration because we have these images that are still not coming in how we want to, but that's okay. We're going to do something with that. But we built out this front end site and we're getting all this data from the backend Strapi application. Whoops. And looks good. And so anytime anybody comes to the main domain, they're going to come to our front end app, and it's all getting pulled in from that API subdomain. So let's go ahead and merge this.
And while it's merging, something important about that thing that we call multi-app. So in just one project, you can have as many applications as you want based also on different languages. So you could have a microservices in Golang on the side or a Python script doing data stuff, and then running your Strapi in Node.js and maybe having a different Node.js version for your front end as well. Every container is fully independent and has its own configuration. So, well, that's a good example. How did you even come up with that one?
This is part of our documentation, polls, examples, interacting with all of our different services using all of our languages, not all, most. But this is that project, router, container, Python, we have our main index, but then Java, PHP, Node, and Go. And then all of these services are all in the same project. So these are all just an addition to services YAML, and these are each a subdirectory in the same repo.
Nice.
Good luck maintaining that.
It's a fun one.
That is literally Chad's job.
Yeah, look at all these dependable updates. All right, that has merged. Let's verify. We got the new URL on master. Sometimes this takes a second.
Could you explain the difference between the, so of course we know the git merge command, but I've seen there is also a platform merge command. Does it mean that what is going to be merged in that case? The source code or the data?
Only the source code. So
Okay.
doing a platform merge is the same as doing a git merge, except that we do extra checks to actually redeploy the environments. It's like a git merge and a git push at the same time. But yeah, no, that's the same.
Okay. And it's also a call to the project to create an environment when I create that branch, rather than, so I could do, or I'm sorry, I guess I'm thinking of the platform environment. I got away from myself, but in the opposite direction, I would do a, like say a platform branch, and that's got to automatically be connected to the project and activate that environment. And so, yeah, I think I lost track of that one. Okay. Sorry, Pierre.
Thanks.
Let's see. Okay. So I did the merge already. All right. We don't. I'm going to go ahead and up my environments because I don't feel like deactivating stuff. And okay, so we have our front-end app on our production environment. So let's move on to the testing of it all. So we're going to wait here and have our dependencies install every commit and our entire build phase run through every commit. So if anything breaks in those steps, we're not going to be able to do our merges because we're going to get a big fat X that says don't do that. But we can stop. So a lot of the times when I'm doing projects like this, I'm actually going to try and integrate my environments to a GitHub repo or a GitLab repo. And so when I set up the integration, I'm normally going to set that up for creating a new environment every time a pull request is opened and destroying it every time that the pull request is merged. And that's great because I can allow it to run alongside all of these different testing suites that I'm already using. I have something set up on Circle CI. I have something with some GitHub Actions. Some Cypress is a new one that I've come across that has to do with sending requests to the application and doing some comparison of make sure nothing visual regression testing. Okay, so that's great. And I can kind of tack those on along with our environment creation. So I have this big long line of tests from all these different apps. But there's another option too, is I have this build and deploy and even a post deploy hook that's set up for each of my application containers, in which I can define separate test commands to be a part of this build that will fail should those tests fail on any environment that I commit to. So I don't have to necessarily rely on learning the syntax of something else or using some other external service to define those tests. I can put it inside the application container itself, make it a part of its deploy phase, and at the same time have access to my database, have real easy access to all these environment variables that are already accessible from within that container and make them a part of my tests, not to mention all this production data that I'm getting on all of these new development environments. So this should be almost done here. I have my tests environment. So we're going to do that. We're going to add a test to our front-end client app. In this case, I got a truncated version of the tests that are already included inside this front-end Food Advisor app, and a little something extra to consider here as well. A lot of what we are trying to set up here is meant to be environment independent. So we want to have repeatable builds, but we could want to, like Guillaume said, have environment variables that aren't production variables in development. And we may even want to have certain steps of our deploy hook, say, like I'm doing here, that aren't run in production. It probably isn't the case that you're going to want to run less tests on production, but it's just shown here for clarity that this is another environment variable provided by us that's accessible inside this deploy hook that can say, hey, only on development environments, branches that aren't master, I want to run this define test. Where do we go here? Here. So I got a React scripts test that I want to run on development environments, and I want my deploy hook to fail if any of these tests fail. And so now this is going to be committed to our code and part of every one of these commits that happens from now on. Let's go ahead and push that up. Rob, Guillaume, is there anything you guys want to bring up in terms of testing CI/CD? I was going to, while this is going, go take a bathroom break very quickly.
Sure.
Thank you.
You can also, as you said, we can include also any other external tooling. We've got a lot of clients using Percy.io to do, for example, visual regression testing. And the fact that we support also webhooks and our API mean that basically you can integrate with anything. That API can also be useful to automate creating and provisioning site as you go. Let's say, I don't know, maybe you've got a big content repository somewhere with your Strapi instance, and then you need to deploy 10 to 12 different front ends because you've got multiple clients or, I don't know, different shops, anything like this. You can also automate that process of bootstrapping a new project, provisioning it with a template connected to your backend after that. So we've been working a lot around what we call fleet at Platform, and that's basically managing a lot of different sites the same way you're doing with one. So pushing updates to a lot of sites at the same time, obviously everything related to security governance as well, but automating all that process. And that's where having tests in your deployment process is really cool, because whenever you're going to push new, whether that's code updates or adding new packages or new modules, we can run those tests automatically and see if there is a problem on a specific site, for example. And we're going to avoid that site being done because of that new update. So once again, we try to be as flexible as we can. Our goal is obviously to abstract everything related to the infrastructure, but letting web developers do everything they need to manage that infrastructure through the YAML file and do all the different customization they need. So as we're running a Node.js project right there, Node has a lot of different versions. We support a lot out of the box. But for example, if you really want to run the latest one, you can also use NVM to actually choose the Node.js version that you want to run in your different containers, or even maybe you want to run a different version in your test as well. Anything, Rob, you would like to add?
No, I have to admit that I am not so deep into testing frameworks.
PHP developers.
Retired developers. Grandpa doesn't write tests. Thank you, Abby. That's the way I roll.
And of course, this last test is hanging here.
And Chad, will you talk a little bit about the how Strapi can be used to in different environments with content in different environments? So it was the what your talk was about. Are you going to add a few words about this at the end of this workshop?
Oh yeah, what I presented today.
Yeah.
A lot of that had to do with running. So in the same way that I have my tests running as, okay, if it's not production, I want to run my tests a little bit differently. I can do that for things like my start command, for example. So a lot of that started with, okay, I can run my start command differently. So I do a full build of a front-end Gatsby app on production and maybe on a staging environment. But then on everything else, I want a development server because I can enable things like live preview and incremental build. So I can get the newest content that's being currently edited on the Strapi backend. And so my talk today was about enabling things like that on the front end. Yeah. And doing the same thing on the back end as well. So what we have set up for Strapi right now is a read-only file system that does a full build of Strapi. But I could also make a definition like run a development version of Strapi on the back end on a development environment so that I can allow an editor to add a new collection to the backend and see what that looks like and get feedback from other authors, or continue to allow authors to have a little bit more flexibility on some aspects of the backend being read-only, or sorry, of not being read-only on those environments. And so we can use things like source operations, which is another thing that we have in our sort of arsenal of tools, where you kind of extend our platform API to, rather than going through the typical commit route in order to make a change to your code base, you can do things like download what's currently inside of one of these mounts that may include new collections that an editor has written. And once you have those in a little sub environment, commit them to the repo so that you ensure that these new data types actually do make their way up to production.
Okay, so the commit will be triggered every time the content type is updated.
That's up to you. I mean, I think I left it pretty open in terms of I had it so that anytime a piece of data in a content type was changed, that would trigger a rebuild on the front end. But if you wanted to trigger a commit every time a new collection was added, you certainly could. I think I imagined it a little bit more as an external API point, but I think maybe the talk was more focused on opening up the trigger than when it would be triggered.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very interesting topic. It's how can we manage environments with a CMS like Strapi, and there are many different ways to do it. And there are different things to migrate from one environment to another. Of course, there is a content type structure, which is quite straightforward at the moment with the Git workflow. But then how can editors get access to a staging environment where they can update the content, and as soon as it is validated, they can actually push this content to production? That's another challenge. And these are part of the things that we will definitely work on in the future in Strapi, maybe with other technologies to see how we can do this. But yeah, that's something that is really important for big teams. We would, I think, in an ideal world, we would like to have something like a Git workflow for content, like we have for the content structure. So that way, content editors would be able to work on different kind of branches and to merge the content. So that way, maybe someone is going to pull the content from production and edit some blog post, and another person is going to get the same content from production, but they're going to update the home page, and then they should be able to push everything in production without any conflict. That would be interesting in an ideal world.
Yeah, you've got a lot of different ways to do that. A lot of other CMS are basically exporting content changes, and then you can run an automated import when you redeploy a new version of it. You could obviously do that through Git, but having a really large Git repository can be a problem if you have a lot of content.
Exactly.
So not ideal. And then you've got specific use cases. We've got a client that is a pharmaceutical company where they basically need that staging site to be exactly the one being deployed, because obviously their legal team is reviewing, sorry, that's not COVID, is reviewing everything before allowing a deployment. So in that case, they are using our snapshot feature to take the data from one environment and pushing that to production. We're also working on not really blue-green deployment, but being able to say in the console, hey, now my production environment is not main anymore, but it's that new environment with that tag or that date. So you are going to be able to switch the production one to another one. So that's one way that could be used for content staging and stuff like this.
And how do you migrate the content from staging to production?
Right now, the only way to do that with a Platform.sh tool is to use a snapshot. So you create a backup and then you redeploy it on production.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, thanks.
You can also play with the CLI. We've got all the different platform DB dump and DB import. So in just a one-liner, you could actually dump your staging and re-import to production, but obviously that takes a bit of time. So it depends on how large your site is.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, obviously not the route I took in my talk. I tried to pick apart the API itself and let a bunch of public permissions allow me to just continue to affect production.
So the snapshot is interesting, but it's a really blunt tool, right? Like if you do the snapshot, you have to be precisely sure that everything on the staging is what you want to be, everything on production. Like there's no incremental merge. And especially if you had like a multi-app environment, like if you had a PIM core and you were doing some e-commerce with Strapi and getting the catalog from PIM core and you did the snapshot, then you'd replace PIM core as well. So I think that that's probably a very blunt instrument for a general use case. It will probably work on many sites if you know that exactly what you have in staging is exactly what you want in production. But if there's any like data on production that you want to keep that's not in staging, that wouldn't work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it has been a challenge for CMSs for the last 2 decades, because even traditional CMSs, there have been the exact same issues.
Oh yeah, Drupal went down this whole road of UUIDs on every entity that it generates, and trying to map UUIDs between systems, and it's huge and bulky and hard and yuck.
Yeah, but yeah, UUIDs are good. Maybe I don't know if it's a good option, but it's one option at least.
So in the background here, I have my tests complete and my deployment passed. So I go ahead and merge that tests environment into master there. And we go ahead and move on to some next steps. So this kind of gets into the getting updated data. One part getting updated data from a backend to a front end application, and another is how data gets inherited from a parent environment. So I have my master environment here. And what I'm going to do is I am going to go into the environment itself and take a look at the API. And in Strapi, I am going to just do something with these images that aren't working right now. So I am going to place media with this image just for now.
You can actually replace what you can do in the media library of Strapi. You can go in the media library in the left menu. If you want to fix this image, yeah, click on media library. And then you can click on the other image. Yeah, this one.
This one?
Yeah. And then you can actually replace the image. So I think if you, yes, replace media at the bottom. So that way it will actually replace the image and it will be fixed for all of your entries. Oh, I don't know why we can't see it. Yep. Okay, so now it's working. Yeah. Okay. And now, yeah, it's fixed for all of your entries.
So we have all my entries here. Thank you, with that image replaced there. And I have my front end is going to go ahead and be updated. That's interesting. I didn't think that would be updated already until I redeployed. Okay, but I also would like to have my development environments that are below this master environment get this new data as I continue to work with the front end and decide how I want it to look, but I want to continue to use production data. So I can go to the front end on this app. You see, I don't have that resolved. What I can do at any time here is I can sync my production data back down into this development environment. So that's what I'm going to do through the CLI, but I'm going to keep the code I already have. I just want data. So I can run that on my front end app, confirm that that is indeed what I want to do. That'll just take a minute in order to do that.
I think I've never used that feature, but it's really cool.
Which one's that? The sync?
Yeah, the sync. Yeah, it's really helpful. So we can sync only from master or also from other branches?
I can restore full backups, I believe, to any of the environments downwards.
Yeah,
But-
you can sync downwards.
Okay.
So
But the sync is just children of the common parent.
Okay. So if I have a development environment, which is a child of the staging environment, it should work.
Yeah, like
Okay,
if I
cool.
had a child of DB, I could continue to sync from production to DB and DB back down to whatever I had below DB there.
Okay.
what most of our clients are doing is basically a UAT or staging environment with fake data, and they sync the dev environment from that staging environment.
Okay.
Should be, there we go. And I have my,
Not here.
there we go. We have our updated production data down on my environment where I added the front end application on in the first place. And there we go. We can now continue to decide how we want that front end to look and sync every time we want updated data from prod. If you are following along or you want to do this yourself, there's also this additional step here where you can deviate from this sort of add on a Postgres service and then tack on the front end app and instead add that front end app to the original environment that just continued to contain SQLite for all of its data. But I'll leave that as a little exploration for you as you go through this yourself. But that is the end of what turned into sort of a demo, but I hope that it was useful to everybody out there. And I hope that if you followed along, that this was clear and worked out for you. And otherwise, that you know that this resource is there for you to play around yourself and try Platform in a multi-app configuration sort of way with Strapi. And I'm happy to stick around and talk about many of the resources that we have here. I have different examples of us doing that. Like here's a template I wrote recently from a blog post you guys had on your website, actually, of 11T being the front end, and another of Gatsby, which was the basis of my talk today. It doesn't have a lot of the fun experimentation that I talked about there, but it is similar to what I just showed, but with a Gatsby front end and some of our documentation and a nice Deploy Friday live stream that we had with Pierre a while back. But yeah, thank you, and happy to stick around as long as anybody wants to talk about Platform and Strapi.
Thank you so much. It was super, super helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Pierre. Oh, Rob, thanks for sticking around.
My pleasure. This was great. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Rob. Thank you.
Bye.
Chad, do you have everyone's email in the Zoom right now so I can send the recording?
Let me double check with Catherine. I'm sure she does.
Or if anyone want that, and if you're on Discord, you can just either DM me or put that into the platform channel. Not sure I can post the recording. Let me see.